The flight of tensions. Danielle Moore approached the airport gate with an air of confidence. Her sleek black suit, tailored to perfection, exuded professionalism, and the purposeful click of her heels echoed against the polished floor. This was a routine she was no stranger to. Another flight, another city, another series of critical meetings that shaped her world as a corporate lawyer and activist. Danielle had fought her way to the top of her field, overcoming countless obstacles to reach where she was now. First-class travel was not a luxury. It was a necessity born of long nights, relentless dedication, and the value of her time. The boarding area buzzed with energy. Travelers milled about, some with tired expressions, others chatting animatedly. Danielle didn't notice the subtle glances her way. It wasn't unusual for her to attract attention, whether for her striking presence or for reasons she had grown weary of explaining. The announcement came through the speaker. "We are now boarding first-class passengers." Danielle gathered her bag, slung her leather laptop case over her shoulder, and walked toward the gate agent. She handed over her boarding pass, smiling politely as the agent scanned it. "Have a wonderful flight, Ms. Moore," the agent said. Danielle thanked her and proceeded down the jet bridge, stepping onto the plane where the scent of fresh leather seats mingled with the faint hum of air conditioning. She located her seat quickly, a window seat in the front row of first class. She placed her bag beneath the seat, settled in, and exhaled deeply. For a fleeting moment, the stress of her life seemed to melt away, replaced by the soothing anticipation of a few uninterrupted hours in the air. But the peace was short-lived. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was crisp and detached, with an unmistakable edge. Danielle looked up to see a flight attendant standing by her row. The woman's uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair neatly tied in a bun, but her expression betrayed no warmth. "Yes," Danielle replied, keeping her tone polite but guarded. "May I see your ticket?" the flight attendant asked. Her name read Amanda Tate. Danielle hesitated, a faint crease forming on her brow. She retrieved the ticket from her blazer pocket and handed it over. Amanda inspected it with exaggerated care, her eyes narrowing as if searching for an error. After what felt like an unnecessarily long pause, she handed it back. "Just confirming," Amanda said, her tone light, but tinged with something Danielle couldn't quite place. "Sometimes passengers get confused about their seats." Danielle forced a smile. "I'm not confused. This is my seat." Amanda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course," she said, but as she turned to walk away, Danielle distinctly heard her mutter, "First class just isn't what it used to be." The comment hung in the air like a bad odor. Danielle stiffened, her irritation simmering just below the surface. She decided to let it go for now. She had a long flight ahead and plenty of work to focus on. She pulled out her phone and began typing an email, but her concentration was soon interrupted. Amanda returned, this time with a clipboard in hand. "Ma'am," she began, her voice now slightly louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "It seems there's been an error with your seat assignment." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "An error?" "Yes," Amanda said, her practiced smile barely concealing her impatience. "It appears this seat wasn't meant for you. I'll need to move you to the main cabin." Danielle straightened in her seat, her tone firm. "This is the seat I paid for. If there's an error, I suggest you check your system." Amanda's smile faltered. "I'm sure we can resolve this quickly if you cooperate." Danielle remained calm, though her voice carried an edge. "I'm cooperating by sitting in the seat assigned to me. If there's an issue, it's on your end." By now, the exchange had attracted the attention of other passengers. A man across the aisle lowered his tablet, his eyes flicking between Danielle and Amanda. Whispers spread like ripples through the cabin. Amanda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, sometimes these things happen. People end up in the wrong place, even if they don't realize it." Danielle met her gaze squarely. "Are you implying I don't belong here?" Amanda's cheeks flushed, and for a moment she seemed caught off guard. "That's not what I said." No, Danielle said evenly, but it's exactly what you implied. The murmurs grew louder. Amanda straightened, clutching her clipboard tightly. She muttered something about verifying the system and walked briskly toward the galley, her composure visibly shaken. Danielle leaned back in her seat, her pulse quickening. She knew this wasn't over. The tension in the cabin grew palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Some wore expressions of discomfort, while others seemed annoyed by the disturbance. Danielle ignored them, focusing instead on her phone. She began jotting down notes about the interaction, documenting every detail. Years of legal training had taught her to stay composed and gather evidence. 15 minutes later, Amanda reappeared. This time, she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant, younger and visibly uncomfortable, stood by her side. Amanda's voice was loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Ms. Moore," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "We've double-checked the records, and I'm afraid there's still an issue with your seat." Danielle set her phone aside and looked up, her expression unreadable. "What kind of issue?" Amanda's lips twitched into a tight smile. "It appears this seat was mistakenly assigned. I'll have to ask you again to move to the main cabin." "No," Danielle said, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm not moving." The younger flight attendant shifted awkwardly, her eyes darting between Amanda and Danielle. Amanda's mask of professionalism began to crack. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You people always make everything so difficult." Danielle's heart pounded, but her expression remained composed. "What do you mean by you people?" Amanda recoiled slightly, her bravado faltering. "That's not what I meant." "But it's what you said," Danielle replied. The murmurs in the cabin swelled. A woman 2 rows back spoke up, her tone firm. "I've been watching this whole time, and she's right. You're singling her out." Amanda's face reddened. She muttered something under her breath and stormed off, leaving the younger flight attendant to trail behind her. Danielle exhaled slowly, her grip on the armrest loosening. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about dignity and justice. Whatever came next, she was ready. High altitudes, deeper truths. Danielle Moore sat stiffly in her first-class seat, the air around her buzzing with tension. The earlier confrontation with Amanda, the flight attendant, still lingered like a cloud, thick and oppressive. Danielle's resolve remained firm, but she could feel the weight of every passenger's eyes on her, their curiosity and judgment seeping into her awareness. She reached for her laptop bag, pulling out the slim black device that had become her lifeline in times of turmoil. Opening it, she began typing furiously. Every detail of Amanda's behavior, every thinly veiled insinuation, every overt action, Danielle documented them all. It wasn't just for her peace of mind. She knew that in a world where perception often outweighed reality, records were power. The curtain rises. 30 minutes into the flight, Amanda reappeared, her movements more calculated and her expression tightened into a veneer of strained professionalism. Her return was flanked by a growing discontent among passengers, their whispers louder now, tinged with judgment. "Ms. Moore," Amanda said, her voice louder than necessary. The calculated volume ensured that every ear in first class could hear her. "I've spoken with the captain, and we've confirmed there was a booking error. I must insist that you move to the main cabin." Danielle glanced up from her laptop, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Amanda's barely concealed hostility. "And I've already explained," she replied, her tone measured but firm, "that this is the seat I paid for. There's no error. Perhaps the problem isn't the system but your bias." A collective intake of breath rippled through the cabin. Amanda's eyes flickered with uncertainty for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Ma'am," she began, her voice losing its practiced sweetness, "I'm simply trying to follow protocol." "Then your protocol needs a serious overhaul," Danielle shot back, closing her laptop with deliberate finality. "Because right now, all I see is harassment, plain and simple." A ripple of resistance. From the back of the first-class cabin, A voice cut through the growing tension. "She's right," said an older woman with silver-streaked hair, her tone sharp enough to slice through Amanda's facade. "I've been watching you. You've been targeting her from the moment she boarded." Amanda spun toward the woman, her professional mask slipping. "I'm just doing my job, Mom." "No, you're not," the woman countered, her eyes blazing. "Your job is to serve passengers, not bully them. And if you think we haven't noticed what's really going on, you're sorely mistaken." The murmurs of agreement grew louder. A younger man in the aisle across from Danielle nodded. "I was wondering why you kept hovering around her seat," he said, his voice tinged with disapproval. "It's obvious what you're doing." Amanda's face turned crimson. She opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her confidence visibly shaken. For a moment, the power dynamic shifted. Danielle felt the tide beginning to turn, the support from other passengers bolstering her resolve. The unexpected ally. In the coach cabin, Ethan Reyes, a freelance journalist with a knack for uncovering injustice, adjusted his camera discreetly. His instincts told him something significant was unfolding in first class, and the snippets he had captured so far painted a damning picture of Amanda's behavior. Ethan's focus sharpened as Amanda retreated toward the galley, her movements stiff and hurried. He had a clear view of her heated conversation with another flight attendant, her gestures animated and her face flushed with frustration. Though their words were inaudible, the tension was unmistakable. When Amanda returned to first class moments later, her demeanor had changed. She was no longer merely dismissive. She was defiant. "Ms. Moore," she began again, her voice tighter now. "If you refuse to move, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the captain." Danielle met her gaze, unflinching. "Go ahead. I'll be happy to explain your actions to him." Amanda hesitated, caught in the crossfire of Danielle's unwavering confidence and the murmurs of disapproval from other passengers. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point when Ethan, unable to stay silent any longer, stood up and stepped toward the curtain separating coach from first class. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin noise. "I've been watching this unfold, and it's clear to anyone paying attention that this is targeted harassment." Amanda's head snapped toward him, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "On the contrary," Ethan replied, holding up his phone. Its camera lens pointed directly at Amanda. "It concerns all of us when someone abuses their authority. And don't worry, I've got it all on video." A ripple of approval spread through the cabin, the energy shifting palpably. Amanda's composure cracked further, her hands clenching at her sides. The captain's intervention. Minutes later, the captain himself appeared, his presence a stark reminder of the stakes involved. He stood tall and authoritative, his gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Danielle and Amanda. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Amanda launched into a rehearsed explanation, painting Danielle as uncooperative and disruptive. But before she could finish, Danielle spoke up, her voice clear and steady. "Captain," she began, "I've been sitting in the seat I paid for, minding my own business, while your flight attendant has subjected me to baseless accusations and constant harassment. I have witnesses here who can confirm everything." The captain's eyes narrowed as he turned to the passengers. "Is that true?" he asked. The responses came swiftly. "Yes," said the older woman who had defended Danielle earlier. "I've seen it all. This woman has been singled out unfairly." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, their voices rising in solidarity. Amanda's face turned ashen, her confidence crumbling under the weight of collective judgment. The captain sighed, his frustration evident. "Miss Tate," he said, addressing Amanda, "can I speak with you in the galley, please?" Amanda hesitated, her expression caught between defiance and dread. Finally, she nodded and followed him down the aisle. A moment of reckoning. As the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, Danielle leaned back in her seat, her heart pounding. The weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on her, But so did the relief of knowing she wasn't alone in this fight. The support from passengers and the unexpected intervention from Ethan had fortified her resolve. Back in the galley, Amanda and the captain's muffled voices could be heard, their tones sharp and clipped. Passengers exchanged glances, their whispers filled with speculation. When the captain returned, his expression was stern. He stopped in front of Danielle's row and addressed her directly. "Ms. Moore," he said, his tone professional, "I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced on this flight. Please rest assured that we are addressing the matter." Danielle nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your acknowledgement, but this goes beyond inconvenience. What happened here is unacceptable." The captain nodded solemnly. "Understood. We'll be filing a full report." As the captain walked away, Amanda remained conspicuously absent from the cabin. The other flight attendants, now visibly more attentive and polite, continued their service with a newfound caution. The seeds of change. As the flight continued, Danielle felt a strange mix of emotions: exhaustion, anger, and a flicker of hope. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. His presence, along with the passengers who had spoken up, reminded her that change often began in moments like these. When the plane landed, Danielle knew the battle wasn't over. Amanda's actions had exposed a deeper issue, one that needed to be addressed not just on this flight, but in every space where bias and prejudice lurked beneath the surface. With her laptop in hand and Ethan's video as evidence, Danielle was ready to take the next step. The story wasn't finished, it was just beginning. The aftermath of Flight 297. The plane's wheels screeched against the tarmac as Flight 297 touched down in Phoenix. The steady hum of engines filled the cabin, but it did little to quell the palpable tension that hung in the air. Danielle Moore sat in her new, cramped seat in the main cabin, her laptop resting on her knees. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, detailing every interaction, every glance, and every word exchanged during the flight. The sting of humiliation still burned, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She had been forced to move from her rightful seat in first class, a seat she paid for because of Amanda Tate's prejudice. But this was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had been silenced, displaced, or dismissed for no other reason than the color of their skin. Danielle intended to ensure this story was told. Whispers at the gate. As passengers began to disembark, a ripple of murmurs followed Danielle. In first class, Amanda Tate stood rigid, her once commanding demeanor replaced by visible apprehension. Her tight-lipped smile was back, but it was cracked at the edges, a thin veil over the unease that was now apparent. Ethan Reyes, the journalist who had documented much of the incident, lingered near the exit, his camera slung around his neck like a badge of accountability. He caught Danielle's eye as she walked down the aisle, and his nod was one of silent solidarity. "Ms. Moore," he called out softly, drawing her attention as they stepped into the bustling terminal. "Do you have a moment?" Danielle hesitated. She had no energy for interviews, no patience for recounting the story yet again. But then she saw the earnestness in Ethan's expression. "I do," she said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of exhaustion. They moved to a quieter corner of the terminal, away from the stream of passengers collecting their luggage. Ethan pulled out his phone, setting it on a small tripod. "I've been documenting what happened," he began, his tone both professional and sympathetic. "This is bigger than just one flight. Stories like yours need to be heard." Danielle crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not interested in sympathy or sensationalism. I want accountability." Ethan nodded. "Then let's start there." The interview. Ethan hit record, his questions precise and deliberate. "Ms. Moore, can you walk me through what happened today, from the moment you boarded the plane?" Danielle recounted the events with the same precision she had used to write her notes. She described Amanda's condescending tone, the repeated disruptions, and the eventual humiliation of being forced out of her seat. "What struck me most," Danielle said, her voice carrying the weight of her frustration, "was how blatant it was. There wasn't even an attempt to hide the bias. Amanda Tate saw a black woman in first class and decided it was her mission to remove me. She used every excuse in the book, but the intent was clear." Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "And when you moved to the main cabin, did anyone from the airline apologize or attempt to address what happened?" "No," Danielle replied, her tone sharp. "Not until the passengers started speaking up. And even then, it was performative." The captain's apology was hollow. He was more concerned with avoiding disruption than addressing the actual issue. The camera captured every word, every flicker of emotion across Danielle's face. When the interview ended, Ethan stood and extended his hand. "I'll make sure this gets out," he said firmly. "The world needs to know what happened." Danielle shook his hand. "Thank you, but make sure it's about the issue, not just me." A growing storm. As Danielle left the terminal, the airport's glass doors opened to the dry heat of Phoenix. She hailed a cab, her mind racing with the events of the day. The humiliation, the solidarity of some passengers, and Ethan's presence, all of it swirled together into a maelstrom of emotions. By the time she reached her hotel, her phone was buzzing with notifications. Ethan had wasted no time. His footage, paired with Danielle's powerful interview, was already making waves online. The title read, "Bias at 30,000 feet. First-class passenger removed in shocking airline incident." The video was gaining traction fast. Comments poured in, some offering support and outrage, others predictably dismissive or outright hostile. Danielle scrolled through the responses, her jaw tightening at the vitriol. Corporate damage control. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, a crisis meeting was already underway. The video had reached over 1 million views in less than 4 hours, and the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack was trending worldwide. "This is a PR nightmare," the airline's communications director said, pacing the room. "We need to issue a statement immediately." The CEO, a stern man in his 60s, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "What's the current sentiment?" The communications director pulled up a chart on the screen. 80% negative. The public sees this as clear-cut racism, and it's not just Danielle Moore they're rallying behind. It's the broader systemic issue. "We're being called out as emblematic of institutionalized bias." "And Amanda Tate?" the CEO asked. "She's been placed on administrative leave," the HR director replied. "But the pressure is mounting to terminate her outright." The CEO sighed heavily. "We need more than a statement. Reach out to Danielle Moore. Apologize personally and publicly. Offer restitution." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Strength in numbers. Meanwhile, Danielle was inundated with messages of support. Civil rights organizations, activists, and legal advocates reached out, offering assistance and solidarity. Among them was a message from a prominent lawyer specializing in discrimination cases. "We can turn this into a landmark case," the lawyer wrote. "Your story has the power to bring about real change." Danielle stared at the message for a long moment before typing her reply. "Let's talk." Amanda's reckoning. Back in her apartment, Amanda Tate sat alone, her television muted but tuned to a news channel. Her face was pale as she watched the footage of herself unfold on the screen. The words "targeted harassment" flashing in bold beneath the anchor's commentary. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, but she ignored them. She knew the airline was deliberating her fate, and the world's judgment was already clear. She reached for her wine glass, her hands trembling. For the first time, Amanda felt the weight of consequences she had thought she could escape. The press conference. 2 days later, Danielle stood at the podium of a crowded press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and reporters shouted questions. She raised her hand for silence, her expression calm but resolute. "I didn't ask for this attention," she began, her voice steady. But I also didn't ask to be humiliated, disrespected, and displaced because of someone else's prejudice. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of discrimination that people of color face every day, in every space, including 30,000 feet in the air. The room was silent, every eye and camera trained on Danielle. This isn't just about one flight or one person. It's about the systems that allow this behavior to persist. And it's about holding those systems accountable. As Danielle stepped away from the podium, the applause was thunderous. She had turned her humiliation into a rallying cry for justice, and the fight was far from over. The fallout from Flight 297, rippled far beyond the confines of the plane. In the days following the incident, the video captured by Ethan Reyes went viral, amassing millions of views. News outlets picked up the story, and Danielle Moore's name became synonymous with courage in the face of systemic injustice. The hashtags #FlyingWhileBlack and #StandWithDanielle dominated social media, sparking a worldwide conversation about racism in air travel and beyond. But for Danielle, the attention was a double-edged sword. Unyielding resolve. Danielle sat in her hotel room, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face. Her inbox was flooded with emails, some offering support, others from trolls spewing hate. She scrolled through them, her expression stoic. The messages from allies and organizations kept her grounded, but the vitriol served as a stark reminder of the resistance she would face. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Ethan Reyes standing there, camera in hand. "Ethan." Danielle greeted him with a nod. "I wasn't expecting you. I figured you could use an ally right now," Ethan said, stepping inside. He set his camera down on the small table near the window and pulled out a notepad. "I've been gathering more stories. Your incident isn't isolated." Danielle raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Ethan opened his notepad, revealing a list of names and incidents. Since the video went viral, people have been reaching out. Black passengers who've been harassed, denied boarding, or humiliated during flights. Your story opened the floodgates. Danielle took a deep breath. This isn't just about me then. It's about everyone who's been treated this way. Ethan nodded. Exactly. I think this could be bigger than we imagined. A class action lawsuit, maybe even a push for policy changes in the airline industry. Danielle's gaze hardened with determination. Then let's make it happen. Corporate backpedaling. At the airline's headquarters, the crisis management team was scrambling. The company's social media pages were inundated with calls for accountability. Prominent figures, including celebrities and politicians, had joined the conversation, amplifying the demand for justice. In a sterile conference room, the airline's CEO addressed a panel of executives. "We've issued a public apology," the communications director began. "But it's not enough. The public wants action." The CEO folded his hands, his face grim. "What's the status of Amanda Tate?" The HR director hesitated. "She's on administrative leave, but there's increasing pressure to terminate her. And it's not just the public, our employees are demanding it too." Several flight attendants have come forward with complaints about her behavior. The CEO's jaw tightened. "What about Danielle Moore?" "We've reached out to her," the legal advisor interjected, offering a formal apology and compensation. "She hasn't responded." The CEO sighed. "We need to handle this carefully. If she files a lawsuit, the financial and reputational damage could be catastrophic." Turning the tables. Meanwhile, Danielle and Ethan worked tirelessly to build their case. Ethan's connections in journalism helped them gather evidence and testimonies from other victims of discrimination in the airline industry. Danielle's legal expertise was invaluable as she meticulously organized the information into a cohesive narrative. One evening, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning a spreadsheet filled with incidents. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "it's not just Amanda Tate. She's a symptom of a much bigger problem." Danielle nodded, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. Institutional bias. It's embedded in training, policies, and the culture. We need to shine a light on the whole system. As they worked, the airline's legal team reached out again, this time with an offer of a private settlement. Danielle read the email aloud, her tone dripping with disdain. They want me to accept a lump sum payment and sign an NDA. Basically, hush money. Ethan shook his head. You're not taking it, are you? Danielle's lips curved into a humorless smile. Not a chance. They don't get to sweep this under the rug. Amanda's public reckoning. While Danielle and Ethan prepared their case, Amanda Tate's life was unraveling. The once confident flight attendant found herself at the center of a public firestorm. News outlets replayed clips of her confrontation with Danielle, dissecting her actions and motives. Former coworkers came forward, describing her as condescending and hostile toward people of color. Amanda's attempts to defend herself only worsened the situation. In a poorly timed interview, she claimed she was being unfairly targeted and accused Danielle of playing the race card. The backlash was swift and brutal. Social media exploded with condemnation, and Amanda became a pariah. Strangers confronted her in public, and she began receiving anonymous threats. Her once comfortable life was now defined by fear and regret. A national movement. As the days turned into weeks, Danielle's story evolved into a broader movement. Advocacy groups organized protests outside the airline's offices, demanding systemic changes. Public figures spoke out, sharing their own experiences with discrimination. Danielle was invited to speak at a national conference on racial equity, where she delivered a powerful speech that left the audience in awe. "We talk about equality," Danielle said, her voice resonating through the hall. "But we don't acknowledge the barriers that still exist. What happened to me wasn't an anomaly. It was a reflection of a system that devalues certain people while elevating others. And it's time we demand better." The standing ovation that followed was deafening. The lawsuit. With the help of a top legal team, Danielle filed a lawsuit against the airline. The case attracted massive media attention, with experts calling it a potential landmark in the fight against racial discrimination. The airline, desperate to salvage its reputation, announced sweeping changes: mandatory bias training for all employees, revised policies to address discrimination, and a substantial donation to civil rights organizations. But for Danielle, it wasn't enough. "This isn't just about policy changes," she told reporters. "It's about accountability. And that includes Amanda Tate." The trial began with a packed courtroom. Danielle's testimony was powerful and unflinching, detailing the humiliation she endured and the broader implications of the incident. Witnesses, including Ethan and other passengers from Flight 297, corroborated her account. Amanda Tate, now visibly worn and defensive, took the stand. Her attempts to justify her actions fell flat, and her inconsistent statements only strengthened Danielle's case. A victory for justice. The verdict was delivered on a sunny afternoon. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the decision. The airline was found guilty of racial discrimination and ordered to pay a substantial settlement to Danielle and the other plaintiffs. Amanda Tate was permanently banned from working in the airline industry. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Danielle" and "End Discrimination Now." Danielle stepped to the podium, flanked by her legal team and Ethan. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "It's a victory for everyone who has been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. And it's a reminder that when we stand together, we can create real change." The cheers were deafening, a testament to the power of resilience and unity. The ripple effect. The victory in court was a monumental step, but for Danielle Moore, it was far from the end. As the news spread, the ripple effect of the case extended beyond the courtroom. Danielle's fight for justice had become a catalyst, igniting discussions about racism, bias, and systemic inequality in industries worldwide. The airline incident was no longer just an isolated story. It had grown into a symbol of resistance against entrenched prejudice. But with her newfound influence came an avalanche of responsibilities, challenges, and opportunities. The cost of advocacy. Danielle sat in her modest apartment in Atlanta, staring at her laptop screen. Her inbox was overflowing with requests. Interviews, speaking engagements, partnerships with advocacy groups. She rubbed her temples, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attention her case had brought. The phone buzzed on the table, vibrating incessantly until she picked it up. "Danielle, it's Robert," her attorney said. "I just got off the phone with a major civil rights organization. They want you to join their board." Danielle let out a heavy sigh. "Robert, I'm not sure I can handle all of this. I'm a lawyer, not an activist." "You're both now," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've become a face for change. That's not something you can walk away from." Danielle stared out the window, the weight of his words settling over her. He was right. The choice had been made the moment she refused to back down on that plane. "Tell them I'll consider it," she said, ending the call. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet hum of the city soothe her. Amanda Tate's descent. Meanwhile, Amanda Tate's life had unraveled completely. Her termination from the airline was only the beginning. The media coverage of her actions turned her name into a symbol of privilege weaponized against others. Everywhere she went, people recognized her, their stares a constant reminder of her public disgrace. Sitting in a small diner on the outskirts of the city, Amanda avoided eye contact with the other patrons. Her once polished appearance was replaced by a disheveled look, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail and dark circles etched under her eyes. She scrolled through her phone, reading the articles about Danielle's victory. Every headline cut deeper than the last. Airline discrimination case sets legal precedent. Racial bias at 30,000 feet. Flight attendants fall from grace. Amanda slammed the phone down, her hand trembling. The waitress approached, her expression cautious. "More coffee?" the waitress asked. Amanda nodded silently, staring at the black liquid as it filled her cup. She wanted to scream, to explain that she wasn't the villain everyone made her out to be. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Building momentum. Back in Atlanta, Danielle met with a team of advocates and lawyers to discuss the next steps. Ethan Reyes had joined the group, his journalistic instincts sharpening the strategy. Together, they worked on a campaign to address discrimination across all industries, not just airlines. "Your story is the tipping point," Ethan said during one of their meetings. "We need to use this momentum to push for broader reforms." The campaign, named Equity in Action, aimed to spotlight institutional bias and provide resources for those affected by discrimination. They created a website where people could share their stories, file complaints, and find legal aid. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, hundreds of stories poured in from across the country. Teachers facing bias in schools, employees denied promotions, customers mistreated in retail stores. Each story was a testament to the systemic issues that Danielle's case had brought to light. A difficult reunion. One day, as Danielle was wrapping up a meeting, she received an unexpected email. The sender's name made her stomach flip. Amanda Tate. The subject line read, "An apology." Danielle hesitated before opening it. The message was short but sincere. "Danielle, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I've had time to reflect on my actions. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. I've lost everything because of my behavior, and maybe that's what I deserve. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Danielle stared at the words, her emotions conflicted. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as too little, too late, but another part recognized the courage it took to admit fault publicly. She forwarded the email to Ethan and Robert, seeking their advice. "She's trying to rebuild her image," Robert said. "Be cautious." Ethan, however, had a different take. "If she's genuine, this could be an opportunity to turn the conversation toward redemption and change." Danielle nodded, though she wasn't ready to decide just yet. She replied to Amanda's email with a simple acknowledgement. "I've received your message. I need time to process this." The media firestorm. The campaign's success brought Danielle back into the media spotlight. She appeared on talk shows and news panels, speaking passionately about the need for systemic change. "Danielle, what would you say to someone like Amanda Tate now?" a host asked during a live interview. Danielle paused, choosing her words carefully. "I would say that accountability is essential, but so is growth. If someone is willing to reflect on their actions and change, we should support that. However, that doesn't mean ignoring the harm they caused." Her response went viral, sparking debates about accountability versus redemption. Some praised her grace and empathy, while others accused her of being too forgiving. The unexpected partnership. A month later, Danielle received another email from Amanda, this time asking to meet in person. Against her better judgment, Danielle agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Amanda looked smaller than Danielle remembered, her shoulders hunched and her eyes avoiding direct contact. "Thank you for meeting me," Amanda began, her voice barely above a whisper. Danielle nodded. "I'm listening." Amanda took a deep breath. "I don't know how to fix what I've done, but I want to try. I've been attending anti-bias workshops and speaking with people who've faced discrimination. I want to do more to help." Danielle studied her carefully. "This isn't about fixing your reputation, is it?" "No," Amanda said firmly. "This is about understanding the harm I caused and making amends." For the first time, Danielle saw a glimmer of sincerity in Amanda's eyes. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a start. The first joint initiative. In a move that shocked the public, Danielle and Amanda collaborated on a workshop series aimed at addressing unconscious bias in workplaces. The initiative, called Bridging the Divide, brought together individuals from different backgrounds to share their experiences and learn from one another. The first event was held in a packed auditorium, with both women taking the stage. Danielle spoke first, recounting her story and the systemic issues it represented. Amanda followed, sharing her journey of self-reflection and the lessons she had learned. "It's not easy to admit you were wrong," Amanda said, her voice trembling. "But it's necessary if we want to create a better world." The audience responded with a standing ovation, their applause a mix of hope and encouragement. A new chapter. Danielle's fight for justice had transformed into a movement for change. She continued her work with equity in action, balancing her role as a lawyer with her newfound advocacy. Amanda's journey of redemption was ongoing, but her willingness to confront her biases and take action earned her a second chance. Together, their collaboration sent a powerful message. Change was possible, but it required courage, accountability, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. As Danielle stood on a stage at the campaign's one-year anniversary event, looking out at the diverse crowd, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was a shared mission, and they were just getting started. A movement beyond borders. The one-year anniversary of Danielle Moore's fight for justice marked a turning point, not only for her but for a growing global movement. What began as a confrontation in the narrow aisles of a plane had evolved into a beacon for social equity. But Danielle knew that the work was far from over. Systems of inequality weren't dismantled in a day, and one lawsuit, no matter how high profile, was just the beginning. Expanding horizons, Danielle sat at her desk, poring over proposals from organizations across the globe. The Equity in Action initiative had grown exponentially, with chapters forming in cities and countries Danielle had never imagined reaching. Requests for partnerships flooded her inbox. Universities wanted her to speak, corporations sought her advice on bias training, and governments reached out for policy consultation. Her phone buzzed. It was Ethan Reyes, who had become a close ally and confidant. "Danielle," he began, his excitement palpable. "I just got off a call with a network in Europe. They want to feature your story in a documentary." Danielle sighed, not out of reluctance but exhaustion. "Ethan, it's not about me anymore. This movement is bigger than one person." "I know," Ethan replied, his tone softening. "But your story is the spark. People need to see what one act of courage can ignite." Danielle leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "Fine," she said at last. "But only if the documentary focuses on the people who've joined the fight. The voices that need amplifying." Ethan grinned on the other end of the line. "You got it." Amanda's continued path to redemption. Across town, Amanda Tate sat in a circle of chairs in a brightly lit community center. The room was filled with people from diverse backgrounds, each there to share their stories of bias, hurt, and reconciliation. Amanda had been attending these sessions religiously since her first meeting with Danielle. It was here that she had begun to truly understand the depth of her actions. A man in his 30s spoke up, his voice steady but emotional. "I spent my whole life being followed around in stores, questioned for no reason, treated like a suspect just for existing. It makes you feel invisible, or worse, like you don't belong." Amanda listened intently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, then said, "I was part of the problem. I didn't see it before, but now I can't unsee it. I'm here because I want to learn and do better, not just for myself, but for the people I hurt." The group nodded in quiet approval. For Amanda, these moments of vulnerability were part of her penance. She knew she couldn't undo the harm she had caused, but she could dedicate her life to making amends. From national to global. Danielle's next challenge was bringing equity and action to the global stage. With the help of Ethan and her growing team, she organized an international summit on racial equity, held in Geneva, Switzerland. The event drew leaders, activists, and advocates from over 50 countries, each eager to share their experiences and strategies for combating systemic bias. The summit opened with Danielle's keynote speech. Standing before a packed auditorium, she spoke with the same poise and passion that had carried her through the past year. "When we talk about equity," she began, "we're not just talking about fairness. We're talking about the fundamental human right to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter where you come from, what you look like, or who you are. This is not just an American issue. It's a global one." The audience erupted in applause, their enthusiasm a testament to the movement's reach. Over the course of the summit, Danielle facilitated workshops, moderated panels, and met with leaders from various industries. She was particularly struck by a session led by a young woman from South Africa, who spoke about the intersection of race and economic inequality in post-apartheid society. "We have to dismantle the barriers that keep people from achieving their potential," the woman said. "And that starts with acknowledging the privilege some of us hold, even unknowingly." Danielle nodded, inspired by the woman's words. She realized that her own privilege as an educated, successful professional had played a role in amplifying her story. It was a privilege she was determined to use for good. Unexpected allies. Back in the United States, Amanda continued her work with Bridging the Divide, the workshop series she had co-founded with Danielle. To Amanda's surprise, the workshops attracted not only victims of bias, but also people seeking to confront their own prejudices. One day, after a particularly emotional session, Amanda was approached by a middle-aged white man who introduced himself as James. "I came here because I saw your story," James admitted. "I used to think people were exaggerating when they talked about racism, but watching what happened to Danielle, seeing how you treated her, it made me realize how blind I've been." Amanda looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and humility. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "The next step is doing something about it." James nodded. "That's why I'm here. I want to be part of the solution." The airline's transformation. Meanwhile, the airline where the incident had occurred was undergoing its own transformation. Under intense public scrutiny, the company had implemented sweeping changes, mandatory bias training for all employees, an independent oversight committee, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. The CEO, who had initially dismissed Danielle's concerns as a PR issue, now publicly credited her for forcing the company to confront its shortcomings. "We're committed to ensuring that every passenger feels safe and respected," he said during a press conference. "Ms. Moore's courage has been a wake-up call for all of us." Though skeptical at first, Danielle began to see genuine progress in the airline's efforts. She agreed to meet with their leadership team to discuss further initiatives, ensuring the changes weren't just cosmetic, but deeply rooted in their operations. A legacy of change. 2 years after the incident on Flight 297, Danielle returned to the skies, not as a passenger but as a keynote speaker for a global aviation conference. The event was held in Washington, D.C., and her speech was the highlight of the evening. As she stood before a room filled with airline executives, policymakers, and advocates, Danielle reflected on how far she had come. "This isn't just about airlines or flights," she said. "It's about the way we see each other, the way we treat each other, and the systems we build or dismantle to reflect our values. Change is never easy, but it's always possible." The audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall. The journey continues. That evening, Danielle sat on the rooftop of her hotel, overlooking the city lights. Ethan joined her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," he said, handing her a cup. Danielle smiled. "We did it, but there's still so much more to do." Ethan nodded. "True, but for now, maybe you should enjoy the moment." Danielle sipped her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. She thought about the people she had met, the stories she had heard, and the lives that had been changed. The fight for justice was ongoing, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. As the city buzzed below her, Danielle Moore knew one thing for certain. The turbulence of the past had given rise to a new era of hope, resilience, and equity. The future of justice. Danielle gazed at the city skyline, her thoughts flickering between the past and the future. While the monumental strides made in the movement brought her hope, she knew that systemic change required vigilance and persistence. As she took another sip of her coffee, Ethan broke the reflective silence. "What's next for you?" he asked, his tone curious but warm. Danielle smiled faintly. "The fight doesn't end here. There are more industries, more systems, and more people who need to be held accountable. But I also need to make space for joy, something I've neglected for far too long." Ethan nodded. "Balance. That's the key." Reconnecting with herself. The following weeks saw Danielle taking a step back from the relentless pace of advocacy. She spent time reconnecting with friends and family, revisiting her favorite places in Atlanta, and embracing moments of solitude that reminded her of her identity outside the movement. One day, while walking through a park, she came across a group of young people holding a makeshift workshop under the shade of a large oak tree. Curious, she stopped to listen. A young woman was speaking passionately about self-worth and empowerment. "Change starts with believing you deserve more," the woman said. "You can't demand justice if you don't believe you're worthy of it." Danielle felt a surge of pride. These were the seeds she had helped plant. Communities coming together, taking action, and spreading the message of equity and dignity. Amanda's next chapter. Across town, Amanda Tate was embarking on a new journey of her own. After months of self-reflection and active participation in equity workshops, she had started a program aimed at educating service industry workers on unconscious bias. Her initiative, called Empathy in Action, focused on fostering understanding and compassion. The first session was held in a modest community hall, with attendees from various professions. Amanda stood at the front, her voice steady but earnest. "I used to think I knew it all," she admitted. "I thought my actions were justified because I was just following protocol. But I've learned that ignorance is no excuse for harm. We all have a responsibility to do better, and that starts with listening and learning." Her honesty resonated with the room. While Amanda's road to redemption was far from complete, she was walking it with intention and humility. the global initiative launch. A year later, Danielle stood on the stage of an international symposium in Paris. She was there to unveil a new global initiative born from the success of Equity in Action. Called Justice Without Borders, the initiative aimed to tackle systemic bias across industries worldwide, with a focus on creating accessible pathways for marginalized communities to seek justice. This initiative, Danielle said, her voice echoing in the grand auditorium, is about dismantling the walls that divide us. It's about ensuring that no matter where you are in the world, you have the tools, the support, and the platform to demand dignity and fairness. The audience erupted into applause, their enthusiasm reflecting the movement's momentum. The legacy of Flight 297. As the years passed, Danielle's story became a case study in universities, a documentary on major streaming platforms, and an inspiration for activists and advocates across the globe. She continued her work, balancing her legal career with her advocacy and mentoring young leaders who would carry the torch forward. Amanda's story also became a point of discussion, a reminder of the potential for growth and change when accountability is paired with a willingness to learn. Her initiative grew, and while she never regained the life she had before Flight 297, she found a new sense of purpose, a quiet reflection. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, Danielle returned to the airport where it all began. The memories of that day were vivid as she walked through the terminal, now adorned with posters celebrating diversity and inclusion. One of the posters bore the tagline, "Dignity in every seat, every flight." Danielle smiled. She wasn't naive enough to believe the work was done, but she allowed herself to feel pride in how far things had come. Before boarding her flight, she sat near the gate, her laptop open. As she typed a speech for an upcoming event, a young girl approached her, holding her mother's hand. "Are you Danielle Moore?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with admiration. Danielle smiled. "I am." The girl beamed. "I saw your story in school. My teacher said you were really brave." Danielle leaned down, her smile softening. "Thank you. And remember, bravery isn't about being unafraid. It's about standing up even when you are." The girl nodded earnestly before being led away by her mother. Danielle watched them go, her heart full. The final flight. As Danielle's flight took off, she gazed out the window at the clouds, her mind a mix of memories and aspirations. She thought about how one moment of injustice had led to a global movement and how much work remained to be done. But for the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of peace. The turbulence of that fateful flight had given way to a smoother journey, one marked by progress, purpose, and hope. And as the plane soared higher, so too did Danielle's resolve to keep fighting. For justice, for equity, and for a future where everyone could fly without fear.